Welcome to Bespoken Bones with your host, Pavini Moray, connecting ancestors, sex, magic and science. Pavini explores transpersonal tools for erotic wellness every new and full moon, engaging educators, healers, spiritual leaders and scientists in revolutionary dialogue. Get ready to feel good and go deep. This is Bespoken Bones.
Hi, and welcome to Bespoken Bones, ancestors at the crossroads of sex, magic, and science. We're in the business of healing trauma, connecting with our roots, and developing radiant erotic wellness in past, present, and future generations. I'm your host, Pavini Moray, and super excited today to introduce you to Simon Thakur. So Simon is an explorer of human evolution and mind-body practice in nature. And he was introduced to yoga at the tender age of 3. And since then, he's been continuously studying and practicing different forms of yoga, meditation, martial arts, combat sports, dance, physical training, and therapy from traditions around the world. And he studies bushcraft and ancestral living skills in Australia. And he works closely with colleagues across Australia within the rewilding movement. And he's been teaching what he calls Ancestral Movement since 2012. And usually, I have folks speak a little bit about their work and introduce it. But what Simon has written about Ancestral Movement on his website, I wanted to just grab a snippet of it and was reading it. And it's just so beautiful and profound, and I think really brings such a different view to this conversation that we talked about it, and I'm going to read it in its entirety. So just settle in, and here we go. Ancestral movement is an approach to embodied practice aimed at radically transforming and expanding the sense of self, exploring and rediscovering patterns of movement and awareness that are part of our species' history, both recent and ancient. Through the practice, we aim to recover the strength, agility, balance, grace, joy, and ease of movement, profound relaxation, and quiet mind that are our birthright as human beings. Many natural movements were essential to our families living as foragers and hunters as recently as a few hundred or 1,000 years ago, and are essential to feeling comfortable and confident in different environments. Things like walking, running, climbing, crawling, lifting, throwing, digging, jumping, balancing, moving silently, and being still. And all of these are built upon far more ancient inherited patterns which we share with other creatures, primates, reptiles, amphibians, fish, worms, even algae and bacteria. With an ancestral approach to embodied practice, we can use movement and awareness exercises drawn from any and all traditions and cultures and spontaneously created according to our needs and purposes to explore the felt sense of the body in three-dimensional space, patiently, progressively opening up every part of the anatomy into conscious awareness, and then continually linking the improved sense of each part with the story of its evolution, and developing a greater appreciation for the existence of similar features and movements in other creatures. The more we feel our own spines, for example, the more we sense the existence and movements of other spines in the world around us. As we explore, we find that the body is full of layer upon layer of extraordinary ancient ancestral power, 4 billion years of adaptation and embodied knowledge, and we start to anchor this understanding of shared ancestry and vast evolutionary timescales in the actual feeling of the body itself. Our perception of time and space shift. We feel the fact that we are giant organisms of mind-boggling complexity, made of water, rock, and air, and more we sense and feel the immensity of past eons right here and now in the present moment. Our deepening sense of ourselves, our minds, and our bodies grants us a deepening sense of the living world and our continuity within it, and eventually, at a certain point, we come back to a very simple and natural form of worship of life itself. The purpose of this work on a physical level is simply to become a properly developed human being, to undo much of the conditioning we've received from our overly biophobic culture, and to pick up the process of physical and cognitive development we left off sometime during childhood. We have been gifted by the hard work of our ancestors with keen eyesight, grip and pulling strength, agility and spatial skills of a primate, the undulating spine, powerful neck, arms and explosive hind legs of a quadruped, the grasping fingers and toes, the opposite arm and leg locomotor pattern of a reptile, a fishy torso wrapped in thick sheets and cables of spiraling muscle, a segmented body structure built around a peristaltic central tube, and the fundamental existence as an oozing, quivering, rippling, pulsating, breathing bag of mostly water. Each and every aspect of our inheritance is a great strength that can be developed if we so choose. Simon, welcome. This is so delicious. So good.
Thank you, Pavini.
Yeah. So just really happy to have you here on the podcast and wanting to direct folks, and I'll do it again at the end of the show, but wanting to let folks know that they can find out more about your work at ancestralmovement.com. And you also have a Facebook group. So I'd just like to start out by asking you, how are our ancestors literally in us? What do you mean about that?
What do I mean? Gosh. Well, I guess the first way to go into it is through, I mean, like we could start talking about genetics straight away, but in terms of the actual, like, using this idea in terms of movement practice and like immediate experience, I guess I just mean that every feature of our anatomy, like from, the shapes of our faces and the types of teeth we have and the fact that we have teeth at all or faces at all, that every little feature of our anatomy is inherited from the previous generation, right, from our parents. And so then my concept, or the way I like to think about and feel ancestry and ancestors, is to try and notice and contemplate the fact that, like, all of my anatomical features are received from my parents genetically, but then that just keeps on going back and back and back and back and back. So I'm carrying features from ancient humans, and then, like, those ancient humans evolved from their ancestors who were, what we call hominids or pre-humans or whatever. That we've got these different names for these different creatures, but this idea that absolutely everything in our bodies has an evolutionary history that's far older than human beings. So primate features, like grasping hands and opposable thumbs and all those sorts of things, like the fact that we have 4 limbs rather than 7 limbs or 8 limbs or 12 limbs or whatever, the spine, all of those things, that each one of them you could do huge amounts of research into. And there's lots of research on this in the evolution of hands or the evolution of the spine. How did spines evolve? Where did they come from? And it turns out, spines evolved in the oceans like some 300, 400 million years ago, and that sort of thing. So on the anatomical level, all that we are is a record of the adaptive experiments and successes of our ancestors, stretching all the way back to the very beginning of life on the planet. So then, if you like, of course, we have the genetic record as well. So it's like we contain, they say we have 99 or 98% of the same genes as chimpanzees, but then it's something like 60% of the same genes we have as fruit flies. And then we share, someone told me the other day that apparently we share 40% of our DNA with tulips, even with plants. So yeah, it's just that idea of, like, the record of ancestry is absolutely everywhere. And in fact, that is what we are. And that is all that we see around us is that record. Like, that's actually what's going on, is all of the ancestors of all time, all coexisting and competing and cooperating and changing and changing and changing and changing. And that's what the ecology of the earth actually is a record of ancestry. Does that make sense?
It's super humbling.
It is humbling. I think it's an important concept. I sort of, part of my agenda in teaching movement practice the way I do is to try and bring back the practice of ancestor worship, which was kind of, largely thought of in the early anthropology, like when people were, like Europeans were encountering other cultures who practiced what they called ancestor worship, and it was thought of as like a sort of primitive form of religion. But I kind of actually think that it's a really important practice for keeping us anchored in our ecology and feeling at home on the planet.
I totally agree with you. There's such a placement in time, like geologic time, when you talk about it like this, right? Like obviously I'm thinking about ancestors all the time, and it gives me a sense of belonging in time when I think about my own ancestry. But I'm only thinking about like, several thousand years of time. And when we think about it like this, it's like, I do feel something inside of me relax into it. Like, oh yeah. Like, oh, there's all this, the embodied wisdom of being a fish, that I don't know. It's just, it's settling somehow. I'm curious of, in your teaching and in your own practice, what happens when we begin to move deliberately as our ancestors moved?
Definitely for me, it is a sense of like coming home and relaxing and feeling like, oh, I do belong in this place, and my belonging in this place is far greater than my limited sense of my personality, that like I and we have all been here for so long, like inconceivably long, since the very beginning. And these movements that you do if you're training or practicing in nature, the kinds of things that you need to do in nature, like running and climbing on rocks and going, squeezing through narrow gaps and climbing up in trees and swimming and all those sorts of things, like that. These movements are movements that are they're adapted to. They're movements that fit with the earth. They fit with forests. We've got specific movements which are adapted to moving through water or walking on land or moving on all fours, these sorts of things. And they're also, obviously, those movements, they're also the classic developmental movements that most humans progress through after they're born, learning to roll around following the direction of the gaze, learning to sit up and move on all fours or to crawl on the belly, learning to squat, learning to stand, that these movements are inherent. So we're practicing, if we practice movements and discover more and more movements which are inherent, then we start to get a greater sense of like, oh, there's all of this stuff that my body somehow knows how to do, that to verbalize and analyze the sequences of muscle firing and, the action potentials going through the nerves and the interactions in different parts of the brain required just to like raise the hand and point the finger is like, it's far too detailed to understand intellectually, but our bodies know. And so same with I always talk about the spine, because the center of the body is this magical, amazing world. And it's often somewhat neglected, I feel, in many movement practices. And so if we look at the spine and the complexity of the skeletal and muscular structures all connecting at every vertebral level, then the spine has inherent in it like this incredible amount of sophistication and fluid, sensitive, three-dimensional movement, like all these spinal waves and snake-like movements and eel-like movements, which are actually inherent in it because it evolved in the oceans, in swimming creatures that were swimming around following their mouths and eating stuff. and our most current movement practice doesn't really engage the spine to that level of sophistication, except for a lot of dance forms and a lot of indigenous dance forms, actually. But when we start moving it like that, and then we start noticing that that's how the spines of all the other animals move, except us, except for some of us mostly perhaps in our city-dwelling sedentary lifestyles, and then we start to move our spines like that, and we start to feel, wow, my spine is like a snaky eel, lizard, like monkey kind of wormy kind of thing. And then we see in all of the rest of nature, we see that pattern repeated in all of the other animals, and we feel like, yeah, right, we're family. This is my family. The horse, the way the horse's spine moves, and the way the tuna, when the tuna's swimming along, it's got a similar spine. And so we start to get more and more of this feeling of the reality of shared ancestry, that we have these different names, like a human is one species, this category of a species, which people have been arguing about since the word first showed up. And then you have a chimpanzee or a cat or whatever, which we think of as different. But if we start practicing these movements, which we all have in common, then we start to feel that, like, oh, they're just another version of me, where their family split off just a little bit longer ago. I'm just another version of them. So we're all just versions of each other. I could just go on and on. Pavini,
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, that's a question that I think about a lot. But so, yeah, that kind of thing makes you feel more at home, makes you feel like part of the family.
I love it. And as you're talking about it, I can't help but move. Like, my spine's moving, right? I'm like, yeah, my snaky eely spine. And then, like, you were talking about, like, swimming in the ocean, undulating in the ocean, following my hungry mouth. And it totally cracked me up. I was like, oh yeah, we're still doing that, right?
Exactly.
We did it in a different way, but we're still doing it. Yeah. And it's beautiful. It's so lovely, this idea of that movement can bring us together in some other ways of understanding. It sounds like what you're saying. Right? Yeah.
There's a whole, like, neurological aspect to this stuff, which I'm really interested in, and it's worth mentioning as well, is this idea that empathy, and what in the neuroscience literature they tend to define empathy in a fairly specific way, where it's the sense of yourself feeling whatever it is that you're witnessing someone else feeling, or the sense of yourself doing whatever it is that you're witnessing another person doing. So a classic example would be, like, when you see someone fall over and, like, bash their knee on something, you, like, go, oh, like, part of you goes, like, oh, like, you feel their pain, kind of thing. So in the neuroscience literature, they talk about how empathy, kinesthetic empathy, the felt sense in your body is this inherent human thing, because we have these highly developed, particularly highly developed in our species, neurological systems, which whenever we're witnessing another person, or even hearing their voice, or even reading about them, our brain gives us a representation of what it would feel like if that was happening to us. And that this is going on constantly all the time, because we're a social species, a social primate species. So it's really adaptive to be able to feel before having to think about it, quicker than you have to think about it, to feel some best estimate representation of what it feels like to be the person who's walking past you on the street, or your friends or whatever. So you've got this sense of how everyone feels all the time in your own body. Now, the interesting thing is that there's a bunch of research that shows that this ability to feel, or this feeling in your body of what's happening to the people around you, that isn't the same across all people. That in some people it is more developed or more accurate, and in other people it's less developed or less accurate than others, and that has largely to do with body awareness. So the lower one's like level of body awareness, the less empathic response, kinesthetic empathic response you'll have to witnessing the movements and actions of other people, for example. So if we go back to the spine as the classic example, if you have never done detailed movements requiring detailed spinal awareness, and you only ever move your spine as one block, then the maps of your spine in your brain will have atrophied. They will actually have degenerated. So you will get less information from what's happening in your spine all the time. And then when you witness other spines moving, you'll have less of an empathic response to those movements. Whereas if you've got massively sophisticated maps of the movements of your spine and your rib cage and all the deep bits of your belly and through your throat and so on, if those maps are very, very highly detailed, whether through your natural gifts or through lots of intensive practice, then those detailed maps that you've got will give you a far stronger, more detailed kinesthetic response in your body when you witness other spines moving. Does that make sense so far?
It does. It totally makes sense. And I'm thinking about, and I think it's not just different with different people. It's also different, like in response to who are you feeling that, right? Like I'm thinking of, I have two descendants of my own, one of whom is a teenage daredevil, and he, likes to jump on things and get close to the edge of things, and basically freaks me out all the time. And because he's my descendant, like, I mean, he always like cracks up because I'm like, stop doing that, it's making my butthole hurt, right? Because like he gets really close to the edge, and I'm like, and because it's my descendant, I feel it in a much different way, I think.
Right.
Whereas I might have a response to anybody who was close to the edge of a cliff, but like when it's, does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And I'll actually, after our interview, if I've got time, I'll get online and start researching that, about how empathy is, because there is a bunch of stuff on it about how empathy like increases or decreases according to kinship ties or lack of kinship ties. And so that's a great segue into the next little step in terms of the empathy research. And this is something that I'm still always on the lookout for people researching it, because so far mostly people are researching empathy between humans, in terms of humans with other humans. But something that has come out is that we don't just like empathy, that kinesthetic empathy, it's not just dependent on how well developed our body awareness is. It's also dependent on the actual specific movements themselves. So if you're witnessing someone else doing specific movements that you are very, very familiar with in your own body, let's say you do a specific type of dance and you're watching a dance performance of that specific style that you've practiced for many hours, then your brain will give you a far more detailed kinesthetic sense, as if you were performing that dance because you have performed that dance. You know what I mean? And so your body awareness might be really well developed, but if you're watching a different form of dance that you have never done, you'll still get a good sense. You'll still get a lot of activity and feelings in your body because you've got a well-developed body awareness, but it won't be nearly as strong as someone else who's done that specific dance style. You follow what I'm saying?
I do. It really speaks to lineage.
Exactly. And so here's the jump. What if you were in a culture, you lived and grew up in a culture in which from the time you were born, all of the adults and all of the young people were regularly practicing and performing the movements of all of the creatures that lived in your local ecosystem. So you grew up, and everyone grew up practicing for years and witnessing as infants, witnessing the adults practicing to a very advanced degree the specific movements of the animals, just the animals, let's say for now, that lived in your area. So if here where I live, there are lots of kangaroos. So if you had spent many, many hours practicing and watching other humans do the exact movements of the kangaroo, and then when you see the kangaroos moving around, your brain will give you a much more detailed, kinesthetic, felt in your own body sense of the movements of the kangaroo as if it was you doing them. Does that make sense?
It's awesome.
Yeah. Whereas if you hadn't done that, even if you had really well-developed body awareness, you wouldn't get that level of sense of your body. Like, it's like I use the metaphor of like you're diving into another body. Every body you look at, part of you, this is an inherent human, amazing human ability that everything we look at, part of our brains sends us into that body and imagines and creates the feeling, not just the vision, but the feeling of as if it was us doing that. But if we practice the movements of the actual things that we lived with, then we'd be feeling that far more. And that's what it seems like Indigenous cultures around the world have always done, and that all of us potentially used to do. And so for those sorts of people to walk through the forest, they would be having a completely different embodied experience to someone who has never mimicked the movements of the forest, in terms of the sense of family and that like heightened empathic response to one's own family members. Yeah, it's a really deep concept. I find it really fascinating.
A really exciting concept to me, because like what comes up for me when I hear you talk about this, like, I mean, it's so like there's such a embodied sense of like opening that I feel like in every part of me moving towards this idea, right? Mm-hmm. And you know, part of the work of this podcast and my work in the world is to help trauma move out of tissues, to help trauma move out of bodies. And as you're speaking it, I'm like, oh yeah, like in my culture, which is North America, West Coast in particular, what am I witnessing my community mates practice in their bodies every day? And what I am witnessing is traumatized bodies. Mm-hmm. Right. And so it really speaks to the value of all of us doing our work around trauma to help trauma move out of the tissues, so that's not what we're practicing and modeling. And you're also talking about mirror neurons and right and empathic response to bodies. Mm-hmm. So it's like if I am living in a body that I have am continually clearing out the trauma that comes in from whatever ways, like I'm actually doing my part in being a member of this, a skilled, well member of community. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Would you speak to that a little bit, to like how movement, because I've definitely experienced this in my own healing with trauma, like movement really supporting that happening, you know, and like a couple of examples that I can just give or quickly are, you know, being at the gym and anything that has to do with like upper body, like especially like push movements. Like I used to just cry all the time, right? Because I would just get to this point where it was in the muscle. And so, but like with practice and repetition over time, that doesn't happen anymore. Right. So like the movement is actually the thing that it wasn't like I was going to therapy and like talking about the trauma that I was holding in my chest. It was like the pushing movement was actually the healing movement. And would you just speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, it's another great topic. And again, like another huge topic, and very complex. And also one that I work with a lot and have thought about a lot, as I spent years as a therapist, the physical therapists, but also, Chinese medicine and yoga therapy. And so some kind of mind-body therapist. And I guess I still am, even though I'm trying to take my work out of the context of therapy these days, just because I like the idea that, sure, we're unwell, we're culturally unwell, and a lot of us are physically and emotionally unwell because of that, obviously, but also I like to frame things in a way that presents it as adaptive. Like, even the idea that in our culture currently, so again, I'm saying our culture, but whatever, in mainstream, modern, urbanized, Australian, English-speaking culture at the moment, the general level of body awareness is very poor. It's really, really not very good. And then the general level of internal body awareness, the ability to feel like the heartbeat and the organs and the movements of digestion and changes in blood pressure and temperature, which is associated with the ability to feel one's emotions moving through the body, that is also very poorly developed in our culture generally, which then also means that we're also less empathic because of that, right? We're still all very empathic. We're naturally empathic as a species, but we're less empathic than we would be if our body awareness was really good and our ability to feel all of the deep changes happening inside our bodies associated with our emotions, if that was better. But so then, rather than saying, oh, that means we're sick, we can also look at it conversely and say, no, that this is actually adaptive, because we currently are the descendants of the last several thousand years of repeated genocide and displacement, loss of access to ancestral land and ways of living, just many, many, many generations of like really intense, interhuman, human versus other human violence and dominance and all this stuff. And so you could say it's actually quite an adaptive response to gradually shut down the awareness of, to actually tighten up the body and cut off sensation from the heart and the organs and the insides. Because when we go there, and this is a very common experience for anyone who takes up meditation or various internal body sensation focused practices, is encountering really intense grief and these all these feelings that are almost overwhelming, and they're oh my God, there's so much intense stuff in there which we haven't dealt with. And so we don't want to give the idea that we should just get in there and feel everything and everything will be fine, you know what I mean? Because that's not the case at all. And so in terms of working with it, so we can first of all say, look, whether it's our whole culture or any particular individual, the response to the trauma is adaptive. The cutting it off and suppressing it so that you can still get on with your life in some fashion is an adaptive response. And then you get to a point and you realize, hey, this is actually really limiting me and I want to work with it and improve it. So how do I go about that? Well, then we get into this art of, okay, how do you use movement? How do you use breathing? How do you actually get in there and start to engage with the internal sensations around the heart and so on in a safe way, in a progressive way, or, all these different ways, like a cathartic, there are intense, amazingly powerful cathartic ways of doing it, whether it's through dance or group work or different forms of psychotherapy or magic mushrooms or whatever, you name it. But firstly, it's well, if we want to look at it, so one of the basic frameworks that I use, which helps make sense of things for me, and it works for some people, maybe some people aren't into it, but if we look at it from a neurological level and we take this simple idea, this phrase that gets repeated in every article and whatever in popular neuroscience, is that neurons that fire together wire together. This is the basic concept of neuroplasticity, that the brain's constantly changing according to experience, and that neurons that fire together wire together. And what that means, or one of the ways that we can interpret that, is that if I have an intense emotional experience, good or bad, then certain neurons, let's say the fear and threat neurons, we're simplifying things, but if the fear and threat centers of the brain are firing at the same time as I have, as I sustain a strong injury in my left shoulder, if we just talk about mechanical trauma, then not just in the tissues of the shoulder, but in the maps of my left shoulder in my brain, the left shoulder neurons will wire very strongly together with the fear and threat neurons. And so what that means is that then in the future, if that experience was really strong and those areas, the left shoulder and the fear and threat, made really strong connections, then in the future there's a good chance that every time I move or even think about moving my left shoulder, my fear and threat centers are going to go crazy. And so then this is the curse of neuroplasticity, is that then if I keep on doing that, then those connections are just going to get stronger and stronger and stronger. But then the way to work with that, is to create a safe environment, whether that's with a therapist or a teacher or friends or just, somehow on your own, create some sort of safe environment and start working with movements of the left shoulder and finding the movements that don't hurt, finding the little fractions of movement in which there is no fear or less fear, and gradually trying to find feelings of strength, gradually building up feelings of trust and working towards feelings of joy and power and whatever, using movements of the left shoulder with whatever amount of slight emotional tweaking that we're capable of, a slight increase in sense of like, it's going to be okay, or a slight picture of the future of my shoulder being more capable than it is now, trust in the process, a sense of, any sort of emotional charge which is different from the existing one, that's different from the fear charge. And so then with little by little, because we're firing the left shoulder neurons and now we're firing some different neurons and different emotional centers in the brain. And so it's gradually going to rewire. The connection with the fear center will get gradually stronger, and the connection between the left shoulder neurons and the joy center or the trust center or the just the feeling nice centers, those connections will get stronger. And so this rewiring will take place. And so then it's possible to do that through the entire body. All of the mechanical traumas that the body's received, all of the emotional associations and the different stories contained in our life history that are associated with all of the different parts of our body and all of the different ways that we can move our body through space, they've all got emotional associations wired into them because neurons that fire together wire together. And that then means that if we can change the emotional associations while using movement to stimulate and wake up all of those little bits of the body and all of the forgotten bits, and the forgotten bits are often the traumatized bits, then little by little, we can rewire new emotional associations, new stories into the whole sense of the body.
There's a couple things here. There's this thing about placement of attention, and on what am I placing my attention? And I think that's a little bit of what you're referring to. Of I think about pleasure, for example, and can I focus on, I have a choice, right? There are choice points in these, the way that our bodies are frozen or numbed.
Yeah.
We do have these choice points, and they have to be consciously practiced, right, over time.
Right.
And can I put my attention on the pleasure of the small movement, or of the freedom, or of the resistance, right?
Exactly.
Can I put my pleasure attention there?
Totally.
And I just want to also name that, in my work with clients, like there's often a lot of grief that comes up that they A, have to do this,
Yeah.
right? Or B, like, oh, it's going to take forever. Or
Yeah.
C, oh, I wish I would have gotten this when I was a teenager, and now I have to do this as a 30-something.
Yeah.
And so there's grief. And in my experience, and I'm wondering if you would corroborate this, that it's actually the neuroplasticity actually takes much less time than people think it's going to take. But when you're faced with it, it seems overwhelming, right?
Yeah.
It seems like, oh my God, I'm going to have to practice this for the next 27 years
Yeah.
right? And it's actually like, well, what if it was just like a couple of times, like the amount of conscious practice that it actually takes to start to rewire things can be minimal, right? A small amount of conscious practice can have a huge impact.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, definitely.
Thanks.
It really
thanks
can.
for saying that, because I totally agree with everything you say. I think that you meant to say that the association with the pain and the fear center decreases as the increase happens with the rewiring towards the joy center in the shoulder.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'm sure you know the big challenge is like you go in and say, we need to learn to feel the pleasure. And in the beginning, that can be just impossible. And so to somehow go, well, okay, so maybe we can't start wiring in pleasure right from the beginning, but maybe we can find kindness or even understanding, acknowledging the process that has made it this way, and like honoring that, like even patience, like being like, okay, patience, and even hope, you know what I mean? Like, let's just wire in, let's just like try and work in some hope and an image of it being a little bit better in a month, you know, like that sort of thing, rather than expecting it to instantly feel pleasure. And Simon says it's supposed to feel good, but it still feels horrible, and all of that thing. So that's the real art, I think.
Yeah. Definitely practicing the patience that it takes.
Yeah.
Would you talk a little bit about like, how do we start? How do we start tapping into the ancestral wisdom that's already in our bodies? Like, let's say I'm somebody who's not particularly embodied and I don't have a lot of physical practices. And I listen to this podcast. And I'm like, oh, that sounds kind of cool. Like, where would you suggest that someone starts?
I guess it depends on the person, because, you know, one of the points of the concept of ancestral movement is that it's all ancestral. Like sitting on the couch and not getting up to go and train is ancestral movement. You know what I mean? It's like we sit on the couch and we don't want to go exercise our bodies because of our ancestry. We like sitting and watching stuff happening on a screen for hours at a time because of our ancestry. Like sitting on the couch watching TV is a fantastic example of ancestral movement. And so is absolutely everything else that we do, because there's nothing that we do that isn't completely influenced by our ancestry. But having said that, you know, certain kinds of movement help us feel into our ancestry in different ways. And so you can, you know, there's a bit of a modern movement happening now of like, if people just look up natural movement, then they're quite likely to find something going on in their local area. And it might be MoveNat, or it might be parkour, or it might be, you know, it could be anything, but it's usually going to involve people climbing on stuff, running a little bit, maybe playing some wrestling games, maybe picking stuff up and carrying it, maybe, you know, swimming or learning to get up and down off the ground easily. Those sorts of, like, that's one concept of what quote unquote natural movement is, and it's great stuff. And so that's a really good place for some people to start. A lot of people in the fitness world are starting to look into MoveNat and natural movement, and, you know, they're going, oh, okay, let's not just work the deltoids, let's practice climbing up and down off something, you know, more. It's gone from functional movement to like natural movement. And I think all of that stuff's fantastic. And so, you know, people don't have to join a MoveNat class. They could just like find someone who teaches good running technique, or go for walks more often, or those sorts of things, but then there's all these other modalities where they're getting people to practice crawling, rolling on the ground, which is good. So any of the grappling martial arts, like whether it's Brazilian jiu-jitsu or judo or wrestling or any variant of those things where it involves sort of tussling with someone and getting up and down off the ground lots of times and rolling around on your back and on your belly and being very three-dimensional. These are all wonderful things which lots of people are already doing, which like really highlight a lot of these movement patterns and abilities that we have in common with lots of other species. So, for some people it might just be a matter of, look, you're already doing it, and just try and spend a bit more time exploring film footage, or if you can see it in real life, other animals doing the same things. Like I've got a post on my website that I wrote about wrestling, where I was looking into all these other animals wrestling, and I was like, wow, like it really seems like they all do it. And I started exploring not just different species, but the different genus, and going like, wow, like, yeah, reptiles do it, even worms do it, fish do it, and they all follow the same principles of like the body following the mouth and these sorts of things. So, that's one thing that people can do, is just actually seek out footage or the ability to witness animals practicing the same things that we are doing, and then noticing it. But another whole way to start, almost at the opposite end of the spectrum from the kind of athletic movements, is all of these different dance forms from around the world, which use the spinal waves, and also a lot of contemporary dance and stuff. They get really good at getting up and down off the ground. And there's a lot of dances which are very sort of like animalistic, not in like a primitive kind of way or whatever, but just where they're actually doing some forms of animal mimicry in their dance forms. So people can take up that sort of thing. But at the most basic level, I recommend people taking up movement practices which strengthen and unlock the entire spine. And so that can be good quality Pilates. Feldenkrais is amazing. Feldenkrais method is like one of the best forms of movement education out there for raising the body awareness and also for discovering the inherent innate movement abilities of the body. Moshe Feldenkrais wrote a lot about a lot of the same concepts that I talk about in terms of the evolution of movement and so on. Yeah, so look, I would just say to anyone wanting to get into it, like some sort of external movement practices involving movement through space and through different sorts of terrain, whatever they might enjoy, whether it's running or just bushwalking or athletics or parkour or something, at whatever level is appropriate for them. And then some sort of internal practice involving getting more detailed awareness and movement in the spine, in the rib cage, in all the hidden parts of the body, the deep parts of the hips and shoulders and abdomen and so on. And then some sort of breathing and meditation practice, like an actual stillness practice involving sensing the insides of the body.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, as you were speaking, I was like, oh, like I wonder what would happen if I just brought more attention to my spine while I was fucking.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's like one of the few realms of movement in which it's not forbidden to undulate your spine. You know what I mean? That's part of the reason why I think in our culture spinal undulations are considered weird and a bit sexual, and you shouldn't do them in public, is because they're a bit too natural.
It conjures up the erotic. Yeah. Anything you want to say about that on ancestral sex or ancestral movement during sex?
Yeah, I guess I mean people ask me about it in my workshops and stuff, and I wonder about it's the same in the rewilding. In the rewilding community, a lot of people have this idea of like, yeah, we want to get wild, we want to be really wild, and we want to release all our inhibitions and so on. And on the one hand, I'm like, yeah, like most of us are a bit too inhibited, and it'd be nice to be a bit less inhibited when we want to. But also the idea of like, I think it's important to acknowledge and accept that like inhibiting impulses is actually another of the defining traits of a human being, and that it's really, really important and essential for humans to be able to live together. Is like, that's part of the thing of a social species, is inhibiting impulses. So I think it's like good to just at the start not get confused about thinking, oh, I shouldn't be inhibited. I shouldn't be, I should just be acting on all of my impulses spontaneously all the time, whether it's like, in sexual situations or otherwise, and go, no, that's not, firstly, it's not possible. And secondly, it's not actually desirable, because we wouldn't be human anymore if we did that. So in terms of experiencing the past and the history in the body, and through practicing that, like in the intro bit that you read, where I said something about getting the sense of, vast expanses of time, and experiencing that in the presence, and that sense of the connection in the body, that this pulsing and beating that we feel in the liquid of the body, that is an unbroken pulse in this living liquid which we're carrying in our bodies, which is the same life from the very beginning of life on the planet. You know what I mean? It hasn't been broken, because that would mean we weren't alive. It's this, what we're feeling is the entire pulsing living earth since billions of years in the past, moving through us. And that bringing up this feeling of worship as a baseline experience in our lives, where we sink in and we feel our bodies, and we look at our bodies and the bodies around us, and just go, wow, this is the whole of life unfurling from the beginning of time through my own body. And all of these creatures, all of these ancient humans and ancient fish and ancient worms, and the actual living ocean itself inside my cells. And then that, sex is so central to that. Ancestry and sex are the same thing in a way, and so to carry that sense into sexuality is good, is wonderful, is like, not just into sexuality, into all of life, but yes, into sexuality itself, to have that sense of just worship of life.
Yeah, it makes it a reverence practice.
Right.
And I do believe that, like, when we are in moments of that kind of sex, that's when we can really feel that, right? Where our cells are open enough to that pulsation of life, and we can really, really feel the life moving through us.
Yeah. And people feel it all the time, you know what I mean? No one has to study evolutionary biology to feel that, people feel it. People feel it a lot. I think, one of the another obsession of mine is pregnancy, and like life in the womb, and the development of a human from a single cell, from the meeting of the sperm and the egg, and like this mind-blowing thing of conception and development and aging and death and decomposition. But the underappreciation in our culture that's given to the magic of life in the womb. And again, like so many women and men, like so many parents, so many people come to these same kinds of like worship of life and awe and humbleness through the experience of like becoming pregnant and giving birth to another human. This is another of the realms where people just naturally experience this same magic that I'm talking about developing through a movement practice. You know what I mean? So it's not like you need this movement practice to develop it. It's like so many thousands and millions of people are experiencing this all the time, just through just through life, just through sex and pregnancy and birth, and through watching their parents or their friends get sick and die. You know, it's the same stuff that we're talking about.
Yeah, this feels like a good moment to just be in that reverence and that awe and in that humility, just in our bodies. I'm grateful for the gift of your body, Simon.
Thank you.
I'm grateful for the gift of life that has moved through your ancestors and is in you. And thank you so much for being here and talking about these things in such a heartfelt way. It's really special to me.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Yeah, I just want to say thanks to everyone who listens, and with gratitude to your ancestors, and may this be a blessing on your ancestors and on all of our ancestors. I'd love to hear from you if you were moved by this episode, and you can go to bespokenbones.com and be in touch with me there if you have comments, questions, suggestions, anything that you want me to know. I'd love to hear from you. I am Pavini Moray, and I will be back every full and every new moon with more embodied goodness and ancestral wisdom. Thank you.